All right, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to our Safety and Security Committee meeting. It is January 27th, just 3 minutes after 3. So we will go ahead and get started. We've got quite a lot to cover. This is a committee of the whole, and so therefore all board members are members of this committee. I have here with me in the boardroom Vice Chairman Haffey, board members Kushner and Cash. And if I am looking on our WebEx feed, where are they? Board Member Scott is with us, Board Member Martin, and Board Member Carter is on, as well as Board Member Johnson Hostler, and Superintendent Moore is here with us as well. So we have pretty much full complement other than Mr. Hagerty. So we will go ahead and dive in and get started. First, if I can have a approval of the minutes from the Safety and Security Committee meeting on 12/16.
I move approval of minutes with a slight correction. There was, I think there was an extra Dr. Jim in there that can be edited out with the approval of the minutes in the minutes.
Okay.
Second.
All right, I got a motion and a second to approve the amended minutes or the minutes with the one said correction. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, show by sign of aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Ayes have it, the minutes from the 12/16/20 Safety and Security Committee meeting are approved. All right, so today we've got a couple of key items. We're gonna do an overview of some of the focus group sessions on the SRO survey. As you all know, we've been engaged in a series of focus groups with various stakeholder groups, including parents, students, the community advocacy groups, as well as teachers and those in the buildings as well. So we'll have a report on the overview of the report from some of those focus group sessions. We'll continue our discussion on the Peace Builders program. We had quite a bit of information that was shared last meeting, so we'll continue that discussion and have an update on some of that information. And then we'll also have a brief discussion on the Sro Memorandum of Understanding. As you all know, we have a typical, that is a normal 2-year MOU. We extended that MOU last year because of the work around the pandemic and just extended the current MOU that was in place by 1 year. That memorandum expires in June, and so we are working in parallel with this work and that of the MOU to make sure that whatever changes and reforms that we may put in place here are part of the upcoming MOU that is due by mid-year. So we'll be hearing from our attorney, Marva O'Keefe, with an update on that process as well. So that's an overview of our agenda for this afternoon. So we will start with the focus group sessions. And so I will turn it over at this time to Dr. Sonia Stevens and Dr. Brad McMillan from Data Accountability and Research. Before I do that, Dr. Gardner, now you're the staff liaison, do you want to say anything before we get into that work?
Thank you, Chair Sutton and members of the board. I don't have anything else to add to your overview of the agenda, except to say we're excited to be here again with you for this very important work. We have 3 big topics in the meeting today to continue to build the foundation for the review of the SR program as this committee is engaged in, as well as to look at other things that support our schools' safety and security in general. So I'm pleased to have With us, representation from the Data Research and Accountability Department, as well as Paul Coe and his team, and then more, as you've identified the three broader areas where we'll cover today. I will say that these meetings have continued to be in response to questions and areas of information that the board has wanted to gain deeper understanding of to help them and support their work as they review the SRO program. So this has kind of been in direct response to inquiries the board has made to learn more about certain topics. And so today, again, is one of those opportunities to do that. Thank you, Chair Sutton, and look forward to a great, productive afternoon.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board. My name is Sonia Stevens, and I work in the Data Research and Accountability Department. I am excited to be before you again to give you an update on the focus group work that we have been engaged in over the past few weeks. So if you could go to the next slide. As you know, we surveyed in the fall students, parents, principals, teachers, and members of our community as part of the SRO program review. Also a part of that review, as Dr. Gardner and Mr. Sutton mentioned, we were also charged with conducting focus groups with as many of those same stakeholders as we could pull together beginning in December, and we're actually ending those focus groups this week. And so we wanted to pull the focus groups together with the intent to be able to unpack the survey results in order to gain a deeper understanding of and hear from our stakeholders. We lined up a total of 15 sessions with our various stakeholders, which included middle and high school students, teachers, and principals. We also invited parents and members of the community to participate. For example, we included representatives from the Education Justice Alliance, El Pueblo, My Brother's Keeper, and the Wake County PTA. And then finally, we also invited local law enforcement officers, including representatives from the municipalities of the law enforcement agencies. So the process that we used for the focus group sessions was consistent throughout all of them. The sessions were conducted online. We used Google Meet to hold the sessions. We had one facilitator at each of the sessions. We also had a note taker, and then we had someone who could help participants if they were having any technical issues that arise or surface during the focus groups. After the initial email invite, we sent multiple reminders about the meeting dates and the times to hopefully get more people to participate in the focus groups. Some of the participants were selected purposefully. For example, we purposefully invited the law enforcement officers. We purposefully invited key community groups and parents. And then also we included the superintendent's advisory group members, which included some of the teachers and students from that group. Other participants were selected randomly. For example, we randomly selected principals, we randomly selected teachers, and also students and parents. This sampling strategy helped to strike a balance between the wide representation of voices, ensuring that stakeholders who are most invested were given an opportunity to voice their thoughts and opinions. As part of the process, we shared the survey report with participants ahead of time so that they could review the report and to see what the respondents actually said. And then to also help set the context for the discussion at the beginning of each of the focus group sessions, we spent a little time giving the participants a brief summary about the major themes that emerged from the survey results. And just as a reminder, some of the three major buckets that surfaced from the survey results included the fact that the majority of the respondents in each of the groups that were surveyed had favorable perceptions overall of the SROs. There was a small percentage of respondents who were unsure or unaware that an SRO even existed in their school or what their role was within the school environment. And then also we shared with the group that there were modest differences among some of the subgroups. So for example, the middle school and high school students had some differences in how they responded to the survey questions. And then there was also some differences between the racial and ethnic groups. In addition to using the same protocol for all of the focus sessions, we also asked consistent questions, which were tailored from the SRO survey responses to ensure, we wanted to ensure that there was fairness, and we also wanted to be able to provide an analysis across stakeholder groups. And during the focus sessions, the participants were first asked to spend a few minutes responding to questions in writing. So we gave them what the prompt was. We gave them an opportunity to respond in writing, and then they were brought back together to dialogue as a group. The conversation was largely between the participants, and we tried to ensure that they talked to one another and sharing their thoughts. The facilitator mainly monitored the dialogue to ensure that all participants had an opportunity to share his or her thoughts. The facilitator also guided the participants as they unpacked the layers of what was being said in order to gain a deeper understanding of the concepts that they were discussing, especially as the dialogue began to unfold. In other words, the facilitator didn't just take the surface level comments and move on to the next question. Instead, quality time was spent discussing the thoughts that were offered, and we repeated the same process with each of the 4 questions. And then the focus sessions lasted approximately an hour. Some of them lasted a little longer, depending on how much participants had to say. Sometimes with some of the groups, some of the participants were very passionate about their thoughts, and we gave them time to express whatever those thoughts were. At the end of some of the sessions, participants shared that they appreciated the format that we used, and they also appreciated the opportunity to share their thoughts both in writing and verbally. They also felt that they had ample time to share and participate. So as I mentioned, we are close to completing the focus groups that we've scheduled. The remaining 2 student groups are actually happening right now as we speak. We also have a teacher group that's scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. That's going to happen around 4 o'clock. And the final community interest and parent group was actually held last night. And we had a good participation, a good group in that interest group. So that was a nice conversation. The comments so far have been very thoughtful. And in the end, I believe the feedback will help us gain a better understanding of the survey results. We have staff that are already working on the analysis of the themes, but we need to complete all of the focus groups before we finalize any of the results. We plan to come back to you with a full report and analysis in February once all of the focus groups have been completed and we're able to take a thorough look at the results. So that's all of the updates as it relates to the focus groups. Are there any questions that I can answer for you?
Thank you, Dr. Stevens, for that report and update. I'm looking to see if there are any questions from board members. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. I just had one quick question for clarification. If there was an opportunity or how we're gathering feedback from members of our own security department in the Wake County Public School System. do those conversations, are those part of focus groups, or how we can receive feedback from the folks in our in the school system who are familiar with the work that happens in our schools?
Russ, I'm going to ask if you would answer that question, if you've thought about that question.
Can y'all hear me?
Or,
We can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. So the security department members have not been included up to this point, but we certainly can, I can certainly gather feedback from them. It's a small number, if that's what the wish of the board is.
Personally, I would appreciate that. I thought I'd asked for that opportunity to also gather that feedback. It might have been one of multiple comments that I said all in a row, so I understand if that may have been lost. But I just think that's also important information, sort of firsthand information, just for overall consideration. So, but that's just my personal ask. Thank you.
I think it would be helpful to have both an internal and external sense of the lay of the land and what's happening, so that would be appreciated. Thank you for that, Mrs. Scott.
Ms. Scott, just to round out the feedback, I appreciate that comment as well. And as we're closing out the final sessions before the analysis of the themes begin, we could have the same facilitators that have been working with other stakeholder groups do a similar process with our internal security team, since they work closely with the SROs on a daily basis with the school. So thank you for suggesting that.
All right. I don't see any other board members that wish to comment at this point. So we'll move on with the next piece of our agenda. Again, Dr. Stevens and Dr. McMillan, thank you for that information, and appreciate the work of those focus groups. That's always a healthy task as we seek to gather input from multiple stakeholders throughout the community. So thank you for that work. All right, the next item on our agenda is the Peace Builders Program, and we want to continue that discussion around this possible program for the district. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Paul Coe.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And Superintendent Moore, I don't think she's there, but good afternoon, board members. So like Chair Sutton said, as a follow-up to our continuing conversation from our December meeting, we're here to present to you further updates about restorative practices and provide more clarity about the Peace Builders program our community members are advocating for. I'm here presenting with Dr. Pettiford, Senior Director of Counseling and Student Services, and Colleen Fitzpatrick, Restorative Practices Coordinator. And I will first pass it to Colleen, who will share some additional information about restorative practices.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Coe. I do want to present this first screen, this first slide, and let you know that the restorative practice team has spent a significant amount of time researching schools and districts around the country that have implemented restorative practices into their school communities. We've also reached out to leaders of this work in these districts for guidance and perspectives of implementing the restorative practices. We have worked to create foundational measures and trainings that would both carry a level of fidelity as well as purpose. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide identifies where some of our guidance has come from in laying the groundwork for our work here in Wake County. Based on our research and collaboration, we identified some commonalities of best practices in these districts. They include things like a full-time leader of restorative practice in each school, tier 1 circles that are preventative and proactive, tier 2 tools that respond to minor disruptions and harm, tier 3 mediation and conflict circles that respond to serious harm, and then ongoing training and coaching for all members of our school community.
And so with that, we just wanted to also add that as part of the meeting package, you should have received an additional PDF document that has further details about the various districts and their programs. So you could refer to that as well if that helps with the question and discussion portion later in this presentation. So thank you, Colleen. And in our continuing discussion to clarify the community interest in a Peace Builders program, we as a district team researched the principles and concepts behind Peace Builders program, similar to the research we did to inform the implementation of our RP work. And knowing that our research and Peace Builders produce limited examples, we met with community members to understand their examples and have better alignment and understanding the Peace Builders program they were advocating for on January 11th of this year. And in today's presentation, we're presenting information for foundational knowledge requested by our board members. And we want to remind those listening that no decision has been made about a Peace Builders program. We're hoping that this information addresses gaps in understanding between our board, staff, and community to get on the same page of understanding of the Peace Builders program our community members are advocating for. And also in this presentation, we'll also share the ways in which Restorative Practices compares with Peace Builders program our community members are advocating for as well. So first, we wanted to note that our community advocates for a Peace Builders program view the role of the Peace Builder as people who are behavior and crisis interventionists who build positive relationships with students, transform the school community into a relationship-centered environment by addressing interpersonal disputes with de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution strategies, and promoting restorative practices. This role of the Peace Builder would be in lieu of SROs and our community advocates' views. I will now pass it to Dr. Pettiford, who's going to share comparisons between the Peace Builders program advocated by our community members and the restorative practices in Wake County Public Schools.
So the next two slides will show you a comparison of the Peace Builders program and its alignment with restorative practices as currently implemented. The chart on this particular slide does indicate the goal of cross-training for staff involved in RP work in our schools. Also, all school-based staff are encouraged to engage deeply in equity and inclusion training. And in the community resilience model training, which is our trauma-informed practice, that is also highlighted as a way to address trauma-informed work that the community says needs to be a part of this particular position. Next slide shows, this chart shows the alignment of Peace Builders and restorative practices in terms of building relationship, addressing conflict, resolution, de-escalation techniques, coaching staff to integrate trauma-informed practices into our restorative practices work. Both the Peace Builders program and restorative practices framework indicates the need for a trained staff member in schools as a coordinator. And finally, the number of schools that have trained circle keepers is also highlighted just to show you the current impact in our schools. Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Dr. Pettiford. And as we saw the comparison between Peace Builders and restorative practices, our community advocates suggest that Peace Builders would build relationships with students, families, and school personnel, trained to intervene with this de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution strategies, and the use of restorative practices, and also act as a coach for staff regarding trauma-informed communication techniques, serve as a positive influence for students throughout their school career, and facilitate a positive school climate and culture. And also, when it comes to intended impact, our community advocates view the impact of the Peace Builders to include reduction of juvenile criminal referrals by law enforcement, mitigation of ACEs through trauma-informed practices, reduction in racial disparities in school discipline outcomes, an increase in parental engagement through building positive connections with parents and students. And peace builders could prevent shooting threats and other forms of school violence through their ability to build deep relationships and provide support to distressed students. And these peace builders would facilitate restorative practices to address root causes of disruptive behavior. And as we close this presentation, our community advocates see the peace builders' role again in lieu of the SROs, and also see the ways the work of restorative practices touches on a number of the intended impacts noted in this slide. And so I'll now pause here for any questions or discussion. I just wanted to note that it was my mistake, but Superintendent Moore is joining us virtually, so she's here with us.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. Cohen, Dr. Pettiford. We'll start with Ms. Mahaffey, Vice Chair Mahaffey.
Thank you. And Mr. Coe, I think you touched on this a little bit in your conclusion. And as Dr. Pettiford was going through the comparisons between peace builders and restorative practices, I had a question on slide 15 on the last row. Is it the restorative practices coordinator at each school? I'm assuming that they have other duties. They might be a teacher or a social worker or a counselor, whereas the peace builder is a standalone position.
Yeah, so to clarify, I'll have Colleen and Dr. Pettiford jump in as needed, but the proposal from our community advocates is the peace builder position would be a standalone position in each school. And for us, the goal is to have a restorative practice coordinator at each school. And what they do is build the capacity of the entire staff to implement practices such as circles to make sure that elements like building relationships are strong within a school environment. And I'll see if Dr. Pettiford or Colleen want to jump in.
Yeah, I would just mention the fact that when we started the work around restorative practices, one of our ultimate goals, of course, was to have a restorative practices coordinator in each building. That was a long-term goal for us because immediately we wanted to make sure that we built capacity of our staff around the tier one work around relationship building circles, addressing conflict, and then also having the mediation work. So it was our hope that as we are able to increase our funding for SEL work in our district, that some of these funding sources might allow us the opportunity to move forward with a RP coach in each building. Now, we don't have a situation currently where we have a person tasked in each building to do that work.
So then I'm curious.
Oh, Ms. Mahaffey, I just wanted to add one more thing. And so currently, our restorative practices is a small but mighty team that is going out to schools and making sure that the schools who have shown interest in restorative practices, they're going out and building capacity and also holding asynchronous and synchronous sessions through our Wake Learns, our Wake Learns, our website, to make sure that the interest is met with training and capacity building with this small but mighty team.
So I guess one of the questions I have as a follow-up, and this might be more of a long-term goal for your department as they grow, is it that having someone in that position to intervene, so if there's an issue, so it's not the teacher that's taken out of instructional time to help resolve an issue, or the counselor who may be doing something else, that there's someone else that can help in the building to help with that conflict resolution. I know we don't have that necessarily. We have it maybe informally now, but more formally throughout the district.
Yeah, I believe Colleen could share something that she learned from the research that we did with the other districts that might shed some light on that for you.
Thank you, Dr. Pettiford. So the idea, Ms. Mahaffey, is that not just one individual would take on that role, but that we would build capacity and tools and skills for several people or all members of the community, the school community, that they would be able to step in and have the tools needed to address conflict. And then having an RP person or RP trainer, if you will, or a person that could come in and do some coaching, additional coaching to help other staff members who might not have all the tools just yet. So it'd be an ongoing coaching type of situation, but we definitely don't want it to be a one-person scenario. We feel it, the wealth of that ability is by spreading that out and giving those tools and skills to more than just one person.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you. So my question was actually very similar to Ms. Mahaffey's. In fact, I had some of exactly the same question, but extending that, I'm feeling a little bit that here again we would gain from an and as opposed to an or approach to this issue. What I guess my question, so I clearly hear that the restorative practice coordinator is a facilitator to have many people in the building trained with the capacity to address these kinds of issues. But do students know who the person is or the people are to go to when there is a point of challenge? I mean, the SRO is a point person. The peace builder, as it's being described, is a point person. We want broad relationships. That really helps on the proactive side of things. But I think that some of the question in terms of structure is, in the event of a specific event, crisis, you name it, who is the person or a small number of people that would be the go-to person to say, help me intervene in this place? So is that possibly, is that envisioned in the restorative practice coordinator model, or is that an area where the restorative practice structure could potentially grow to have, 2 or 3 point people in a school that would have maybe a little bit more directed face that students could go to, or a staff member could go to say, hey, I need help on this specific issue?
So thank you, Dr. Martin, for that question. And I see Colleen nodding her head. I just wanted, before I pass it to Colleen, in our previous presentations, if you recall, we had that tiered approach where tier 1 is about circles and tier 2 is about addressing the more minor conflicts that, like a classroom issue where 2 students may need to work it out. And, the circle work has been the foundational component of our work so far. But where we're trying to build capacity is at that tier 2 level. And we have our partnership with Campbell Law to do the facilitated mediations when there is the more challenging conflicts that are like fights or big incidents at the school that require more facilitation. And so with that approach, and if you connect that to our goal of having an RP coordinator at each school, that's always a funding question. But if we had that, there, both in building the capacity of the staff at the school level, but having these coordinators or facilitators at the school would create a situation where point people would be available should those incidents arise. And I'll see if Colleen wants to add anything.
Well, and before she does, and I appreciate that, I guess that's where my thinking is that, the tier 2 and tier 3, Campbell Law School is great, but that's usually intervening after the fact. And I think the component of tier 2, tier 3 that could have the advantage of having a person or a couple of people in a school would be for dealing with the situation while it's unfolding, as opposed to, okay, it happened, now let's try to understand and bring some reconciliation.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that would be the idea behind that tier 2 approach.
Yeah, and then if I might add, Mr. Martin, it is an idea of being proactive. And I think some of the work that we're doing, especially with staff, through modeling and having circles with staff, they begin to see this practice as a tool that they want to know how to use because they see it as so productive. So I do think that there are scenarios where teachers reach out to other teachers who are using this to say, hey, how could I do this? So I do see this as something that people watch and see and want to know more about because they're seeing results of community building, of being able to meet conflicts in different ways that feels more holistic. So those are the things that are catching fire, and the idea that it's voluntary really is a buy-in for teachers because they see that there's not an additional pressure, but they really see this as a tool that builds that sense of community, and it really is that proactive kind of piece. But again, we're doing that with staff, and they're seeing the results with themselves, so that feeling carries over to their classrooms.
Thank you for that. Mrs. Cash.
Thanks for that explanation on restorative practice. I'm not sure I can't actually visualize all that activity, so I'll have to look at that better. It sounds like it's working well. I don't know how much we've put as resources into restorative practice, but and so I was wondering. My question is, I heard the Peace Builders say in lieu of SROs, and I guess there was some conversation that the Peace Builders and SROs can work together. So are we talking about a restorative practices plus Peace Builders in a school and then no SROs? Is that there would be, and then do we still put funding into counselors and psychologists? That's my question.
Ms. Cash, thanks for that question. I think we haven't proposed any plan per se to the degree that you're describing, but I think we're just bringing information to you so that if you recall in the December meeting, the Peace Builders program that we researched was actually one that is in districts like San Diego where you have to purchase curriculum and get your own coaches. And we realized that from both feedback from the board and our community advocates that they were espousing a different type of program. So we met with them to make sure we're clear on the tenets that the community advocates are looking into and asking us to look into for this Peace Builders program. So we're bringing you that information so that as we think about what modes or models that we want to implement at the district level, I think that's up for the board discussion here. But we just want you to know that restorative practices is going on. There is this Peace Builders program that our community members are advocating for. And we wanted to provide you this information so the board can make the best decision with as much information as possible.
So the Peace Builders, though, they do present their program as not working with SROs, as being in lieu of.
Yes, ma'am. That's what they were advocating for in our meeting.
Just a follow-up question then. If at the point that it becomes a situation that maybe can't be handled, is it a call to a 911 call that brings extra non-trained police into the building then at that point? Is that what is the in lieu of? I'm just trying to understand so I know how it would work.
I think if we made that decision, we would have to actually come up with additional protocols to guide schools and what to do in emergency situations. So I think that's a part of the factors in decision making in this topic of discussion that we should look into. But we haven't decided on what this would look like yet. We just wanted to present this information to make sure you had it as we furthered our conversation around SROs, restorative practices, and this Peace Builders program.
And I promise one final question. Is the restorative practice people in our schools now, do they work with the SROs?
I think I'll see if Colleen and Dr. Pettiford want to add more, but In years past, we've had, I think we've done a restorative practices training with our SROs, and I'll see if Dr. Pettiford wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add that we have made that connection, and it was in also one of the previous presentations when Russ presented information about the trainings that were available that we've collaborated with them on, and understanding of the Restorative Practices program, and in particular mediation services was also presented. And we're in talks to continue that work as well. We have had SROs attend some of our awareness trainings just so they could learn more about it. And I think the key thing I would want to go back to in response to Dr. Martin's question as well was that when we had the conversation with the community stakeholders, there was a lot of alignment with the restorative practices and the peace builder work. So, and they made it a point to say to us, they're supportive of the restorative practices work that we're doing. So I do want to point that out so that the board has that information as well.
Thank you for all that information. I appreciate it.
I had some similar questions to Ms. Cash. I just want to sort of follow up on that, Ms. Kushner, and then I'll come to you with questions. Mr. Cole, you mentioned, or you, Mr. Pettiford, Dr. Pettiford mentioned in the presentation, as Mrs. Cash alluded to, that the suggestion or recommendation from community advocates in implementing peace builders that it would be in lieu of SROs. Do you have a sense in your conversation with them, and I'm not asking you to speak for them on their behalf, but in your conversation with them, do you know if they are open to a sort of a both and situation? Because obviously, or it appears that there are some things that the peace builders, the iteration of peace builders that they're talking about would not be able to handle crisis situations. They mentioned that this would be a proactive step to perhaps head off or curb school shootings or other crisis type situations. But at the point where there is a crisis situation and it requires emergency intervention, assuming peace builders is not equipped or designed to offer that sort of intervention. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think we'd have to dialogue a little bit further about their stance on the both and, but the meeting that we had was very productive. And I think we have a lot of parallel intended outcomes as organizations. So I think, regardless of the outcome of how we approach SROs, they're open to continuing to work with us. Mm-hmm. I think we're up to the same efforts. But when it comes to are they open to the both and, I think based on the reports that they've shared with you all or just what they're advocating for in that PDF document that's been widely shared, I think they strongly state that SROs is something that they think should not be in schools. But in terms of like a compromise, I think we'd have to have further dialogue with them to see where they stand in that regard. Right.
And you mentioned that peace builders, and I don't know how they're set up in terms of if they're a nonprofit or a for-profit entity. You mentioned they have a curriculum and that sort of thing. Is this version or iteration of peace builders in terms of what the community advocates are promoting? Are we allowed to alter the program in this sense, or has there been some connection or contact with peace builders in an official capacity, if you will, to use the program? Because it sounds like this use of peace builders is not exactly the way that it was intended, or at least based on what you all found. So there seems to be a bit of a divergent use or view. So would we be allowed to do it in that way, or has there been any due diligence?
Yeah. So, Mr. Sutton, to your question. So what we presented back in December was one version of a Peace Builders program that we were able to research in partnership with Campbell Law. And what we found was that there's a specific nonprofit organization that's done work in districts like San Diego, where their approach to the programming is to, at each school level that wants to do that version of Peace Builders they would have to purchase, license essentially curriculum, but also purchase coaching services. So that's one version, but we know that from that December meeting that our community advocates were not advocating for that specific program, but a different version of a Peace Builders program that is more aligned to what we presented today around a specific position that does all the work of building relationships and, a training to intervene and de-escalate situations, act as a coach for staff, and serve as a positive influence for students. So that is a separate, what our community advocates are advocating for is a different program. And, they call it either Peace Builders or Peacekeepers from their lens. And I think in terms of what we're open to, I think that would require further dialogue with our community members to make sure that we're clear about where they stand.
So is this the same program? It's a different version. Or is this two different programs that then I'm assuming it's the latter, that it's two different programs that perhaps have the same name?
Yes, sir. It's two different programs that have the same name. And our community advocates were able to clarify for us, in our presentation today that we presented, what they're advocating for.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful. Mrs. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And that helps, Dr. Coe. I'm just looking at the supplementary document that's in Assembly that you shared and trying to parse out some of the summaries. Can you go through, is the bold just for y'all's own emphasis, or does the bold text connote anything? And then just a quick overview. It looks like some of these school districts have eliminated SROs, but others have kept our SROs, so they do have both restorative practices and perhaps a peace builder model as well as SROs. And have you all been able to see any examples of districts that have that are doing both and?
Yeah, so first, I believe the bolded elements are some of the tenets from the various districts and external organizations that we've taken to help implement the programming. We saw those as best practices that we wanted to take, borrow, and implement within our district.
Okay.
And Colleen and Dr. Bedford, do you want to add anything about that before I go to the next part of the question? All right, so I think we're good there.
Yeah, and it seems one of the best practices is to have a full-time restorative practice coordinator at each school, and you said that's our long-term goal.
Yes, ma'am. So that is, I believe that's in the Oakland, under the tenets around Oakland. Mm-hmm. And also, in Chicago Public Schools, they have a restorative practices lead that they recommend at each school. And like you said, some of these school systems still have SROs along with the restorative practices facilitator or coordinator at each school. And so, yes, there are examples where they coexist together, SROs, restorative practices folks working together in the school system. And, having come most recently from Oakland prior to them voting to rid of SROs, like I worked at Oakland Unified while school systems, I think they were seen more as security staff and not specifically police officers because they're part of Oakland School Police. And I believe what Oakland voted for this past fall was to, dissolve that organization of Oakland School Police that's not connected to Oakland Police Department. They're separate organizations. So that's been dissolved. And I think from talking to some of my colleagues who are out there, they said that now they're thinking about, going to, Ms. Cash's question about what to do in emergency situations. Now the district is working on what do we do to respond to like crisis situations or highly threatening situations. So they're working on that as a group.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kirsten. Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Coe, I think you answered most of my questions, because I was going to ask you to reference back and talk about Oakland, who I knew did have been working on this much longer. So that's certainly helpful that you were able to share that with us. And of course, you know, I think we've talked about this before, but it is a larger conversation for our board, and we've had multiple, right? Like if we have SROs in the building, if we don't have them, how do we work in relation to all the other law enforcement agencies, all the way to the, I would say the most extreme from where we are today is to Wake having its own set of law enforcement officers to respond. So I do think that that's a larger conversation, and thank you. I'm putting a pin in that for us to come back to after we've gone through all of the research and information, all the data from the focus groups that are still happening today, and thanks to the team who are making those happen. But I do think that that's kind of, in my opinion, a little further into our conversation once we have all the data and information in front of us. I do want to go back to the question around school resource officers currently being trained on these models, or if they are used in conjunction. Dr. Pettiford, you responded that they've attended some trainings. I guess I'm wondering, do we know for certain, for instance, in schools who have used a restorative practice or where Campbell Law has been responsible for the restorative practice, in those cases, do we know if SRO officers may have been involved at the beginning, if they are kept up to date on the restorative practices? I'm just curious how we ensure that they are aware when we're doing restorative practices. And context, I'm asking the question because so much of this is really about culture change in our buildings, around our beliefs. So many of us, just a natural being U.S. citizens, we have a punitive framework for how we respond to anything, and that's just who we all are. And so I'm thinking through, what does the process look like when we already have, for instance, Campbell Law in the schools that they've been in long term? What does those relationships look like? And can we look to see if there's been culture change in those spaces where it's existed longer?
Sure, we can certainly look into that and figure out long term what kinds of things have occurred. What I will tell you is that when we have the MOU discussion with Campbell Law, part of their process is to go in and meet with the administration team of that school. Oftentimes it includes either the department chair for counseling and student services or maybe the counselor, and they will also include their SRO officer, because the SRO officer can also make referrals. And some of the examples that Campbell will use in their videos and things show an officer who was dealing with a particular situation, and that officer was the one that made the referral to Campbell. So we do have instances of where that has occurred. How systemic that is would be something we would have to dig deeper into. And of course, as you know, some of that changes with changing staff. So certainly have an implementation plan for doing that would be important.
Thank you. That is certainly helpful, and you got straight to what my question there was. And then I guess the other question, which we may not know the answer to, and that is in the research, and I'm like Ms. Kushner, was trying to sift through the summary that you gave us, but do we know or begin to have conversations with any of the districts of what, if they have like a timeline or lessons learned for those who've implemented restorative practices and or peace builders, of what that process looks like for them in terms of integrating that into kind of the institutional structure of the school system or particular school?
Thanks for that question, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. I think that's something we have to look into, get more of a clear summative answer. But I do know that, having come from the Bay Area, both San Francisco Unified and Oakland Unified, they've been at this for about 10 years. And I think there's various degrees of implementation waves that have happened where, for a time, depending on the superintendency, leadership, like if it's emphasized, all schools will go for it. but when it gets a little bit de-emphasized because other priorities come up or budget cuts happen, the wave kind of dies down a little bit. But I do know that in Oakland, amongst the principals, I think restorative practices was done to a degree where, as much as possible, that was the expectation of the administrators to be as restorative as possible. But I think to say that it was 100% fidelity around that, that's a hard thing to say in any district. But I think we'd have to look into what lessons they've learned, because I think the districts who've been doing this a while, I imagine they've gone through various implementation waves and I think we'd have to talk to them a little bit more to see what that looked like over the last decade.
Yeah, thank you. And you hit the nail on the head. I'm certainly not surprised that you see ebbs and flows with leadership change, budget cuts. So thanks for pointing that out, and that would be helpful. The last question I have, again, either of you can answer, and certainly from your experience, Mr. Coe. So Wake is not the only school that's, talked about the impact of racial biases and discriminations, specifically around response to SRO. And I'm curious, in the other school districts that you've talked to, if they've been able to speak to distinct differences or changes in their discipline practices around students of color and minority populations.
Yeah, and Dr. Pettiford and Colleen can speak much more expertly about this, but I think I would start us off in our own initial pilot with our Kellogg grant when we started the restorative practices programming at the elementary sites. And when you see the suspension data, for example, there was significant decreases from our evaluators from year over year of suspension. So, we do see that impact within our own system. And I think we'd have to look at the data of other districts, but I imagine they've continued this programming because they've seen those decreases, right? And I think when you talk specifically about racial bias and disproportionality, I think that, in some ways that's a nationwide challenge that we're up to, and there's a lot of work to be done around that. But we know that restorative practices does help with the overall decrease of suspensions within our own system. So we hope that that's evidence for us to, if we can decrease suspensions overall and, get as close to zero as possible at every school, then we know that can help with the racial bias work as well.
Thank you. Last question. I put my hand down, Mr. Sutton. Do we know from looking at any of the other previous OCR complaints from other school districts if they've used any other innovation to directly respond to any OCR complaints those other districts had around disproportionality and suspension? Because, in their resolution, they usually have to list what steps they've taken. So I was just curious if we know if there are other things that I may not be aware of that school districts have seen greater impact.
I think that's something we'll have to dig into a little bit, Ms. Johnson-Osler. And oftentimes with our OCR response, we're focused on our work, and there's plenty of kind of just how we organize what we've been up to, but it's something that we can look into and bring back to you at a later date.
Thanks very much for your patience. I appreciate that, both Dr. Pettiford and Mr. Coe.
Yep. Could I add one more thing?
Sure, yes, sir.
So our recent work around folding equity and inclusion into our restorative practices work as well as our SEL work, that's one of the strategies that has been mentioned in particular with restorative practices work, to be able to first build relationship, then have those conversations which are more conflict oriented, but it's around equity issues. And so that kind of partnership of bringing those kinds of conversations into the circle space is something that the team has been studying, and they've actually started working on some of that with a book study, and additionally, how do we fold that into our training so that people are prepared to have those conversations? Because you participated in the small group discussion with me at the church. You can't control what's going to come up in the conversation. So you have to be prepared for equity issues when they arise and how you're going to address them and have crucial conversation around it. So that has now become part of the training that we're doing around circle work, but also with the mediation as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I'm glad to hear that. Thanks for all the work that you all are doing and your entire team, because I know, having worked with your restorative practice team, that it's not just you, but thank you all, and please let them all know I appreciate the work they're doing.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hoster. Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you. I had a follow-up because we had talked about Campbell Law and their mediation program, which is a phenomenal program. I'm curious, does Campbell Law have the capacity to handle the mediations that we refer to them as we begin to see it more normalized in our district?
Thanks, Ms. Mahaffey. I think that's a good question for Dr. Pettiford as well, but I know that for the most part, when referrals are made, Campbell Law so far has been able to meet the demand. And Dr. Pettiford, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that question, because not only have they been able to meet that demand, but we are also working with them to train folks who've had Circle Keeper training, who've been doing it for a while, to be able to also understand the basic tenets of mediation. So we are actually building the capacity of our team to be able to do that work as well. And we've got great examples of, situations where Colleen or one of her team members have gone with the Campbell Law to mediate a situation at a particular school. So that is already in the works, and we're building capacity, because at some point, we hope that the relationship lasts forever, but we also have to be realistic in that we need to be growing our folks to be able to do that work as well.
Thank you. And that was, go ahead, Mr. Coe.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Ms. Mahaffey, also the thing to add is that, in terms of our ability to build capacity, our goal is to build the capacity of the school folks in restorative practices. But again, we note that one of our goals is to have a restorative practices facilitator at every school, because we think that is one of the best practices that we've gleaned. So when we think about mediation capacity, adding those positions is something that would help that process as well.
Thank you. And that's kind of where I was going with my follow-up was, again, as Dr. Pettiford said, not to sever that relationship with Campbell Law, but to build the capacity of our district to have that, so that if a need is maybe not as severe to go to Campbell Law, but that it could be facilitated at the school level. I remember being in middle school in the 90s and being a peer mediator, and I don't know if those are still around today, and I'm certainly not suggesting it, but just the ability of someone in the school to have that conversation and facilitate those conversations at the school level, so there can be some more immediacy. So I appreciate that.
That's a great point. Thanks, Ms. Mahaffey.
All right, thank you, Ms. Mahaffey, for that question. All right, I want to thank the team for coming back and bringing this information, and particularly reaching out to our community advocates to get some better clarity and understanding about what it is that they would like to see and are promoting in our schools. We certainly appreciate that, and that's helpful to give us some perspective as we continue our work to consider options and think about how we move forward. So thank you, staff, for that.
Mr. Sutton,
yes.
May I also take this opportunity and privilege to expand that appreciation from the staff?
Yes.
For the willingness of our community to meet with the team and the student support services. Following our preliminary discussion of this in response to the board wanting to know more, as well as our own team researching it more based on the interests expressed by our community, we felt it important to have this deeper discussion today. And I can't thank the board enough for their thoughtful questions and comments, identifying elements that will have to continue to be unpacked as we work and see the interplay between a Peace Builders program and its concepts, restorative practices, as well as whatever is decided about the SR program. So on behalf of the team and the district, we too want to thank the community members who are willing to meet with us, because we felt going forward it was important for all of us to align, both community, board, and staff, on the Peace Builders program and its concepts. So I just want to extend that thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner, for that. All right, that takes us to the next item on our agenda, and that is the SRO Memorandum of Understanding. And so at this point, no, we are joined by Mara O'Keefe with Tharrington Smith, and I think Mr. Blumberg is also with us this afternoon.
That's right.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Superintendent Moore, board members, and senior staff. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to join you today. As Dr. Gardner indicated at the outset of the presentation, my purpose today is to simply remind the board and senior staff of issues that have come up across the prior 4 meetings regarding potential aspects of the SRO program that might merit further changes, further consideration, and consequently might prompt changes to the SRO MOU. To be clear, there's been no decision made by the board to date about whether or not to continue the SRO program. So I'm before you today simply to remind the board first of the 2 questions that were the drivers for some and really much of this committee's work when the committee first convened back in July of 2020. One question, first and foremost, was, does the district wish to continue contracting with local law enforcement agencies and placing SROs in schools? The second question, of course, was, to the extent the board wishes to continue contracting with and placing SROs in schools, to what extent does it wish to change any aspects of the SRO program, and to what extent does it wish to make changes to the governing document for that program, which is presently the SRO MOU. When I looked back at my notes from meetings and thought about the dialogue that committee members had with senior staff, it became apparent to me that lots of the ideas, suggestions, and questions about potential changes to the program, and therefore the SRO MOU, again, to the extent the board determines that it wants to continue with the SRO program, could be categorized in one of 3 areas. Area 1 is training and qualifications of those who operate the SRO program. Area 2 is interventions by school administrators and SROs in response to student misconduct. And Area 3 is monitoring and assessing operation of the SRO program. What I'd like to do is briefly walk through the key inquiries that have come up and the suggestions for potential changes to the SRO program in each of these 3 areas, both to remind the board about what they've said previously and also to solicit from the board any further ideas, questions, or areas that they'd like staff to explore more as they consider whether to continue with the SRO program. Once I've run through each of the areas or issues identified for each of these 3 buckets or categories, I'd welcome further discussion by the board so we can be sure we've incorporated any and all feedback about additional potential changes to the SRO program. So as I said a moment ago, the first area or bucket is training and qualifications for those who operate the SRO program. In the last 4 meetings of the Safety and Security Committee, board members have raised the following as areas for further discussion. First, increasing opportunities for district input on qualifications for hiring of and for school assignment of SROs. There's been a lot of helpful dialogue and information provided by Mr. Smith about the extent to which school staff and administrators in particular have had input into who's hired as an SRO and how those SROs are placed in and assigned to schools, especially high schools. So board members have raised that as one area that could be modified should the program continue. The second would be increasing opportunities for district input on training of SROs conducted by agencies. And to be clear, when I mention input of district employees on training of SROs, I'm not talking about the training that district staff and someone from our office provides at the SRO Summit every year. Instead, I recall that Chair Sutton and other board members asked to what extent it might be possible for the district to have input in training that local law enforcement agencies themselves provide to SROs. As Mr. Smith discussed, I think at the September meeting of the committee, SROs are required to undergo specific training pursuant to state law promulgated by the North Carolina Criminal Justice Education and Training Standards Commission. They go through that with the Justice Academy. But in addition, there was an expressed interest by board members in potentially adding some other subjects and categories to that training to ensure that the goals of the board are something that SROs are aware of before they come on to provide their services. Third, board members have raised the issue of providing additional training to high school administrators, specifically on issues that proved challenging during the prior year. There was some discussion in the October meeting specifically about ensuring that there are some robust opportunities for SROs and for school administrators to partner together and walk through practice scenarios to ensure consistency of response across schools in the district. I'd like to move on to the next category or bucket of areas and issues identified by the board for potential changes to the SRO program. The second area is interventions by school administrators and SROs in response to student misconduct. I see this as really the heart and the meat of the current SRO MOU and getting really at the central mission of the current SRO program. Board members have raised the following as areas for further discussion. First, re-examining criteria for referral to the SRO and what information should factor into an SRO referral. As you all know from the current SRO MOU and some of the information provided by Dr. Gardner and Mr. Smith at prior meetings of the committee, there's much language in the current SRO MOU that emphasizes the theme that SROs are to serve as the last resort. They are to be there for those kind of code red incidents of student misconduct that present a safety or security threat to others. There's been discussion by board members in recent meetings of this committee about re-examining what the specific criteria or trigger points are for a staff member to refer a student's misconduct to the SRO, or the criteria by which a staff member has the authority to enlist the assistance of the SRO. There's also been an inquiry about whether there can be further guidance or parameters provided both to school staff and law enforcement about the extent of information that can be exchanged. For example, providing guidance to school administrators that reminds them or precludes them from providing disciplinary history to the SRO as a factor in making a referral, or even factoring that history in and deciding whether a referral in the moment is appropriate. Second, board members have raised the issue of providing clearer definitions of the misconduct that falls on that borderline between moderate and serious misconduct. I think assault is a really good example of that. If there's a fight that is isolated, that is handled or dissipates quickly, providing clearer guidance about whether anything about that fight needs to be referred to the SRO or whether it can be handled in its aftermath squarely by school administrators. This would help possibly, according to some board members, clarify who should respond first, the school administrator or the SRO, and paint a more vivid picture of what that response could look like. By providing those clearer definitions, I think the proposal was that we could have potentially better consistency across school settings in what the responses look like to that conduct that really falls on the brink of severe misconduct and moderate misconduct. Third, with respect to how SROs and school administrators work together and intervene with student misconduct, there has been a proposal to consider whether aspects of the Peace Builders program can operate in conjunction with aspects of the SRO MOU. There's been discussion of that today. And for example, board members had previously discussed at one meeting whether an interventionist, for example, could be the first responder for student misconduct. So could a peace builder representative or staff member be the first responder when there's conflict? And then could there be certain parameters created so that to the extent the misconduct escalates and creates a safety issue, it is only then referred to an SRO? Finally, board members have raised the issue of broadening the scope of available restorative practices, including by coordinating with additional mediation resources. Board member Mahaffey just mentioned moments ago the bandwidth that Campbell Law has to accommodate mediation requests. Beyond that, there's been some interest expressed by board members in seeing whether other law schools or local resources that have youth justice clinics might be willing to also partner with the district and provide some resources that could support both its interest in restorative practices and also providing other methods of resolving conflict without resorting to a referral to the SRO. And then there's the third and final category or bucket of ideas board members have had for potential changes to the SRO program and MOU. And this is monitoring and assessing operation of the SRO program. Board members have identified whether it might be possible to increase avenues for district staff and other stakeholders, including, of course, students, to provide feedback on operation of the SRO program. Now, you've seen in the last several months, district staff have convened focus groups. They've had surveys largely driven by the central question of whether to continue the SRO program. What I have heard in lots of these meetings since July has been a keen interest by board members in ensuring that there is more consistent opportunity for stakeholders of the SRO program, should it continue, to provide feedback, not only about how the program is working and whether the SRO MOU is being consistently implemented, but about what their lived experience is with the program, so that the program can be modified, and of course the governing document can be modified, not just every 2 or 3 years when it's up for renewal, but consistently as we seek for the program to meet the board's goals and objectives. And finally, board members have identified providing mechanisms for stakeholders to express concern specifically about performance of the SRO at their child's school, especially through submission of the form. Right now, per the SRO MOU, there is a process for complaints regarding SRO performance to be funneled kind of up the chain of command, so to speak, within the security department to Mr. Smith. There are also mechanisms right now for removal of an SRO or barring an SRO from school property. However, there's been expressed interest by board members in creating a more direct form or conduit from a community member or parent directly to the board to identify a specific concern regarding SRO performance. So that would be another thing that we could potentially consider when modifying the program, should it continue, and then looking at how to modify the governing document for the program. So I've gone through my list of what I recall as being the highlighted areas board members would like to see potentially modified or addressed should the SRO program continue. I'd welcome at this point board members' feedback on additions to any of those categories, or of course, additions of items for further discussion or inquiry that don't fit cleanly into any of those 3 categories.
Mara, thank you, first of all, for being here today and for putting this pretty comprehensive list together. I have to say you've done a masterful job at just capturing the expressed ideas, concerns, and putting them very nicely and succinctly into this document and into these 3 large buckets. I think you've sort of captured it all, even going back to meetings and discussions beyond the 4 meetings of the Safety and Security Committee. But I will open it up at this point to board members first to see if there's anything that is that has been omitted. Ms. Mahaffey, Pastor Mahaffey.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. O'Keefe. I echo Mr. Sutton's sentiments on your thoroughness and capturing that. One of the questions I have is that our current MOU and our MOU, since it's existed, has really been a document for our high schools. And as the SRO program has expanded, it's gone to our middle schools and to some of our elementary schools. So I'm curious of, I guess I would add to that, what are the different, do we need to disseminate, high school versus middle school versus elementary as we move forward in this? Because there are differences between those different levels of interaction and the students that the SRO serves. And I'm also curious, as I read through the MOU, I see things about searches and investigations. I don't see anything in particular in protocol for restraints from law enforcement agencies with our students, and I guess I'm curious to hear more about what those protocols are for our law enforcement agencies when they have police officers assigned to our building, and that's what I have to add.
So to speak to your first inquiry, Board Member Mahaffey, I agree with you that there are differences in terms of kind of what the most common scenarios are in terms of the interactions of SROs and school administrators at the high school, middle school, and elementary level. I do think it will be possible for the operation of the program, should it continue, to be discussed in one central SRO MOU, but I would posit that perhaps where the rubber meets the road in the training there could be kind of more perhaps specific targeted training for middle school principals versus high school principals and elementary school principals. I think that the array of student misconduct that those administrators deal with, to your point, pretty markedly differs. I think also research shows that the impact of students on referral to criminal law enforcement differs and can have markedly different results depending upon the age of the juvenile, at which point that juvenile first interfaces with the criminal justice system. And although Dr. Gardner and Mr. Smith can speak far more articulately than I can to the substance of the training provided, I think that the training might be the best place to really clarify what intervention by the SRO looks like and what serious misconduct versus moderate misconduct looks like for an elementary kiddo versus a high school kiddo. With respect to your second question, I'll look at the document in the next few minutes. I believe there's a reference to use of force in the current SRO MOU, but you're correct that there isn't an entire provision in the document specifically about restraints. In speaking with law enforcement last summer at the request of some senior staff members, I recall that some local law enforcement agencies were revisiting their own internal policies and procedures when it came to the parameters for use of force and the parameters for physical interaction with a third party. I would be happy to revisit those and provide to the board what those policies currently are. It's my understanding that SROs would be beholden to those policies as they're governed by their local law enforcement agency. But that's not to say that there couldn't be a provision in the SRO MOU that squarely addressed and kind of in more robust language addressed the circumstances in which the school board is comfortable with there being physical interaction of an SRO and a student.
I'm just thinking with our students, we have parameters for restraint as school-based employees, and so I'm just curious to see where that extends with law enforcement and what that looks like, because these are juveniles that we're dealing with.
Yep, and I'd be happy to kind of collect that information from the agencies and provide that to the board if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
All right, I've got a couple of questions. I'm not seeing any other hands at this.
Yeah,
point.
Mr.
No,
Chair,
sorry,
there
Mr.
are
Hegarty.
hands up.
Mr. Hegarty.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Or sometimes when you're virtual, you get overlooked, so I had to speak up there.
I was scrolling up just to see, and I caught yours just as you were speaking. So sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you again, Ms. Aki, for a wonderful presentation. I do have a series of questions for you. I did think that you did a good job of capturing some of the concerns that we had, especially around governance, complaints, and reporting. Can you remind us again, in the negotiation process, is this a memorandum that we negotiate separately with each LEA, or is this something that we negotiate collectively?
So it's something that is negotiated collectively because ideally the central SRO MOU governs our relationship with every single agency that provides SROs. Now the bulk of SROs are provided by the Sheriff's Department and Raleigh PD, but throughout the process, including now the focus groups, we seek to get and collect input from all law enforcement agencies. So to the extent a law enforcement agency that provides fewer SROs, say, than the Sheriff's Department has concerns about a provision, our goal would be to iron out those concerns so that there's real consistency in performance and expectations of SROs, regardless of the assigning agency.
Thank you, because that gets to a concern that I have, in a county as large as Wake, even though we do have between the Sheriff's Office and Raleigh being the largest municipality, a lot of coverage in our schools, you do have a lot of independent LEAs, each with their own policies and procedures. And as Ms. Mahaffey mentioned, and you had mentioned, recently there's been a lot of work by some of these agencies to reform use of force guidelines, to conduct internal investigations. But not everyone has done that. And what I'm curious about is if if we develop a standard MOU form, say if 6 of 8 or 7 of 8 LEAs agree to it, but one doesn't, what happens then? Can we enter into the agreement with the other municipalities, or does every single agency have to be satisfied before we can proceed?
Without getting into discussion that I think would fall under attorney-client privilege, and I'd rather preserve for closed session, I'll say that I think that there would be 2 factors to consider. One would be the jurisdiction of the agency that wished not to sign on to specific parameters. For example, if the board came up with its own kind of robust use of force policy that it wanted to apply to law enforcement, and it found that 6 law enforcement agencies' own policies aligned with that, but the remaining law enforcement agencies' policies did not, it could consider whether the reach of, for example, the sheriff's department and its jurisdiction would cover the jurisdiction of those smaller municipal law enforcement agencies, and whether there was bandwidth by the sheriff's department to provide SROs for those areas. So I think that would be a consideration. I think also the district could choose to contract with certain law enforcement agencies based on what their internal policies are. However, I would caution that I do not know enough about the extent of bandwidth that those local law enforcement agencies have to fill the demand for SROs, at least in years past. I think Mr. Smith could probably speak to that and might need to run some numbers just to see in the past, have we been able to fill the positions we have sought to fill for SROs? Again, I think in an ideal world, you'd have all agencies signing on to that one central document for consistency. So to your point, to the extent there were something that was really important to the board that any local law enforcement agency did not agree with, that would be something I would want for us to identify really soon so that we could have lots of dialogue about that and see if there's a way to resolve any disagreement.
I appreciate that. And so then that goes to timing as well. You know, I don't want us to be in a situation where we've presented, you know, the terms that we would like to see, and then, you know, they're held, negotiations are held up, and then there's a last minute refusal on the law enforcement side to where there's no time to come back to negotiate. And as I've stated before, to have a contingency plan, you know, where, you know, terms are being dictated to us rather than us putting forward, you know, the conditions that we think are important to families in our community. So if you could, I don't know if it's appropriate now or later as a follow-up, just kind of brief us on this year's timeline and the availability for negotiating. And then just one last thing that I didn't hear in your list, but I think has come up recently, is just being clear that I think we would like some input into the ability to either refuse a specific officer if there have been complaints or problems, or to block the reassignment of an officer, where if there are problems at one school that they just don't get passed on to another school. That's something that's very important. And if there is a problem and there's an investigation going on, the investigation may clear them, but until that time, I don't think they should be in the school.
Yep. To your last point, I'll add that to the list. And I think you're right. I apologize for missing that, because I think that was the driver for kind of the bigger issue I highlighted of what input can the district have and can administrators have in assignment or reassignment of SROs. So I'll be sure to add that into the hopper, so to speak, for that bucket or that category. In terms of the timeline for negotiating, what I can say is that back in July, I recall that Dr. Gardner and Mr. Smith kind of presented a guideline or timeline it hoped to commit to with respect to how this would go. I think largely we're on track to hit that timeline, which was to complete the SRO survey and to complete convening focus groups by February, for the board to have a work session in February and an opportunity to unpack the data that had been obtained. Approximately by March, determine as a board whether you wish to proceed with the program, so that during the month of March, the board could give the green light to or bless a governing document for how it sees the program moving forward. Again, if the program does move forward. Per the timeline we presented in July, that will leave the month of April for providing that document to local law enforcement agencies and also to members of the public for feedback, input, and thoughts on how the contours of the program would operate and how that governing document would operate in governing the program. Then that would leave us with May and June for finalizing the document and negotiating any final changes. So that was the prospective timeline that we put before you in July. As I think we've all learned, if we hadn't learned this before, as a result of 2020, timelines, boy, can they change based on other things that come up and the needs of the school system. But I think we're on track to accommodate that timeline now. I'll note that I think one aspect of the timeline that's important that perhaps Dr. Gardner or Mr. Smith could look into and speak to is what the deadline is for the school district to request any sort of grant funding from the state to support an SRO program. To the extent the district is reliant on some of that funding, it would be important for the board to make a decision before that deadline so that it could take advantage of any of that funding, as that would markedly impact the amount of money the district needs to spend on supporting presence of SROs in schools.
Great, thank you.
And the only thing I would add to that is that we will begin, based on the feedback today and Mara's presentation, I mean, we will begin working on the MOU and putting revisions in the hopes of expediting. So if the board is ready to move forward or not, if they decide to be ready to move forward, we won't start our drafting then. We will have already been working on that so that we can expedite.
Thank you for those responses, and Mr. Hagerty for the question. Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Thank you. I only have one question left. Again, I'm with Mr. Hagerty. It's tough being online for the meetings. So my follow-up, which is only one, to Mr. Hagerty's points, or Jonathan can respond. Have we had conversations about what we already know is going to directly impact this timeline? So I'm just trying to think about, have we prepared such as we know that there's transition happening or on the horizon for at least two of those law enforcement agencies, which I would imagine even if someone who's already in the department becomes the chief of either of those two departments I personally know of in transition, they may or may not have been engaged already with SRO work. So I'm just curious, how far ahead can we think of opportunities that may stymie this conversation? Again, I just want to be very clear with the public that if we're going to find ourselves at a place rushed again, that we've at least done our due diligence to think through what to slow this timeline down again.
I think that in having focus groups with law enforcement now, that's one way we've tried to forecast whether there are going to be hiccups with the timeline. Certainly to the extent board members are concerned about specific agencies and want for me or for anybody else to reach out to those agencies now to get a temperature check about their thoughts on the SRO program and the work the board has already done through this committee, I'd be happy to do that. I'm sure Dr. Gardner would be happy to do that. Board Member Johnson-Hostler, so that we can forecast those concerns. To your point, I think that we want to hew as closely as we can to the timeline we've projected so that the board really has a fulsome opportunity to take into account public feedback and local law enforcement feedback as soon as possible once the board makes a decision about which direction to go.
Thank you. I mean, I certainly would say the more we can be proactive, the better. And again, it's one thing, and I don't know who you're talking to in those focus groups, so I don't really know. Ultimately, is it the decision maker, like the chiefs who actually sign off on the MOU, or is it the lieutenant or captain who oversees SRO officers? Again, I don't know what their individual decision-making processes are, so I could be way off base, but it's one of the things that, at least it's in the top of my head, that could delay processes if whoever the decision maker is hasn't been engaged in these conversations at this point.
Certainly. And I'll just add, to the extent there's a director from the board to go ahead and solicit feedback as if we're going to proceed with the program, I or Dr. Gardner, I think we can do that. And that might accomplish the concern you're understandably highlighting, is how much of this feedback can we get now? I haven't personally done that yet, simply because I didn't want to put the cart before the horse as the board is still engaging in kind of the difficult decision of whether to continue with the program.
That absolutely makes sense. And, you know, I have some strong feelings one way or the other, but I also want to forecast what could be hiccups. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Mara, let me ask a question or two. Given particularly the first couple of slides and just given the general level of oversight that the board has expressed expressed an interest in having over the SRO program, particularly around having input around issues such as training, hiring, reassignment of officers due to misconduct and that sort of thing. Obviously, one of the more effective ways or pathways to provide the board and the district with that level of oversight would be to have our own security force or law enforcement agency. Now, that as an option, and it's come up again today, it's come up in several meetings, is one that we will need to discuss as a committee because that has its own set of pros and cons. But my question is, if we chose to go in that direction, my assumption is that would then eliminate the need for an MOU, because I guess then at that point we would not have a relationship with the local law enforcement agencies that are here. So I don't want to assume that though. So my question is, would that eliminate the need then for an SRO MOU, number one, and then number two, if we were to go that route also, how would that also impact the criminal justice partnerships agreement as well?
Certainly. So first, to the extent the board were to have its own essentially law enforcement unit, right, and operate and deputize those individuals, first, I think there would need to be local legislation authorizing that. There are a handful of school districts in North Carolina that have their own law enforcement agencies. If the district were to have its own law enforcement agency, would there be a need to contract with third parties? No, because those resources would essentially be in-house. However, I would be remiss to suggest that the absence of a need for the SRO MOU or contract would obliterate the need for a similar, if not identical, type of document that governed the parameters of the role of those in-house law enforcement agents and when we want them to intervene, when we don't want them to intervene in student misconduct. I think that is probably the most challenging part of implementing any SRO program, and I don't think that would be any different even if there were, for lack of a better term, district staff members serving as kind of the in-house SROs. To address your second question in terms of how it would impact the school justice partnership, I think it would impact the school justice partnership in that the district would still have an ongoing relationship with law enforcement, as has been discussed in prior meetings of the school justice partnership, as has been discussed by this board for years. Irrespective of whether SROs are in schools, juveniles are referred to the criminal justice system, sometimes for misconduct in schools, sometimes for misconduct outside of schools, and the board is keenly aware of the impact of those referrals on juveniles and their experience educationally and otherwise. So I think that the mandate from the Administrative Office of Courts for local districts to have school justice partnerships would not in and of itself be affected by the presence or absence of SROs. I think instead the contours of the relationship between the school district, local law enforcement, and the DA's office, for example, would perhaps be examining more closely the role of law enforcement once things are occurring or referrals are made outside of school versus referrals coming from within the school system itself.
Okay, thanks. That is helpful. Any other questions for Attorney O'Keefe from board members at this time?
Sorry, one other question, and you may have answered it. Maura, Attorney O'Keefe, how aware are...
Please just call me Mara.
Thank you. I just thought about it. I was like, wait, Chair Sutton called her by her last name. I should be far more formal. We are live. So my sincere apologies, because of course offline I do call you by your first name. My sincere apologies. I am curious, but Chair Sutton made me think of this, which is sort of in line with my last question. Do we know if all of the chiefs of the LEOs are aware that we're fully engaged in this conversation? Of what transition, not just that we're revisiting the MOU, but the possibility that our relationship could change. Do you know how aware, at least at the leadership level, I shouldn't say chief, at the leadership level, they're aware of these conversations?
I personally know that some agencies are aware. I also want to note that in the last 5 years working with local law enforcement, I've had only productive and collaborative discussions with both the agency chiefs and their lawyers. They've been a pleasure to work with and have always been super responsive to feedback that I've provided on behalf of the board. They've also been really solicitous of giving me feedback about how the program is going. I will also note, though, Board Member Johnson-Hossler, that I've made Lauren Freeman aware, because she's so deeply involved in the work of the School Justice Partnership, that the board is undergoing this work. So to the extent that presence or absence of an SRO program changes the direction or needs of that school justice partnership, that group can really pivot and address those needs.
Thank you for actually adding that piece too. Thank you very much. And thank you. I appreciate it. That's it, Chair Sutton. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I think that sort of brings us to closing or rounding out the agenda. Board members, as you have heard this discussion, really all of the items on the agenda, but particularly last discussion around the MOU, this signals to us, or should signal to you, that we are nearing a decision point around providing some direction to staff, our attorneys, in terms of what we would, what we would like to do, because obviously we have some important time frames to try to adhere to. I think that was a big part of the reason why Mara is with us today, to share that with us. Again, as you know, and I want to remind those that are here and listening in, that we extended the last MOU by 1 year, and I think that ended June 30, and so again, that extension would bring us to June 30 of this year. Is that correct, Mara? I think you mentioned it earlier.
That's correct.
So that leaves us then really about the next 4 months or so. If you look at a monthly meeting in February, March, April, May, our desired outcome with this committee was to be able to gather information, gather input, and from this committee, which is a committee of the whole, but will be making a recommendation to the full board to making a decision about the future of not just the SRO program, but certainly the safety and security of our law schools. But the SRO program and the future of that program are really being governed by some time restraints. So somewhere in the next few months, we will need to make a decision, number one. We may need to take some time beyond these safety and security committee meetings, and also have some sharing during work sessions, so that we have enough time to gather all the information and input that we need, so that we can make an informed decision. So I just share this as information to you all, so that you are aware of the work that is ahead of us, and that we are very near some important decision points about what we want to do to, again, ensure the safety and security of our schools, particularly around the SRO program. Ms. Kushner.
Can I just ask a quick question? Can we get a revised timeline of, because I think it's important, you're making an important point, that we know when we'll be receiving more information. I know initially we were supposed to get the focus group feedback, for example, by middle of February, and it looks like we might be able to adhere to that. But if you could give us a have staff give us an updated timeline, I would find that useful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Gardner, we should be able to do that at our next meeting? Sure.
We can absolutely do that. We'll be working on it to give it to you as a follow-up.
Okay, and perhaps even sort of laying out what are some next steps in terms of options, modifications, and that sort of thing to the program, and hopefully, again, coming up with a solution that our entire community can live with. Vice Chairman Haffey.
I'm just curious, you had mentioned a standalone force. We've talked about mediators, increasing our restorative practices, and those all have budget implications. So if that can get addressed at some point as well, I think that would be helpful.
No, we certainly will do that. And I was not trying to signal any direction or the other in terms of my question about a standalone law enforcement agency. But again, when you think about referring to, Mara's slides and the level of input that the board and the district wants to have, it is significant. And I think we have, if we're honest, I think at least run into some hesitation, at least or concern with law enforcement agencies about that level of input in prior MOUs. And so I think that is something, again, that we have to consider, and I have said all along from the onset of the work of this committee that we would weigh all options. All options are on the table as we, again, try to arrive at a suitable outcome for all of our students, employees, family, communities as well. Mrs. Cash.
Just to be clear, when we are talking about this subject, is this an option as well that high schools, middle schools, elementary, that they can be, there may be different avenues for each set of schools?
It is my sense, just kind of listening to the conversation today with Ms. Mahaffey, Vice Chairman Mahaffey raised her question, that we may very well be looking at, and I think Mara addressed it, that if we are engaged in an SRO MOU, that it would be one comprehensive, but I think from an operational standpoint and looking at our decision points, we may be looking at a different option for each level, be it middle school, high school, and elementary, because the needs are vastly different, if you will, and even some of the data has shown that the needs and the efficacy, if you will, is varied at those different levels.
Okay, thank you, Chair Sutton.
Mm-hmm. So again, just keep that in mind. Again, board members, as again, we'll have an updated timeline and some of those decision points. And as Mrs. Kushner indicated, some of those things will have some budget implications. That wasn't you. That was Ms. Johnson-Hostler said that. Somebody said that. But at any rate, that they will have some budget implications. And to Mars, I was not aware that if we do consider our own security or law enforcement, that would require legislative approval. I was not aware of that, so that is helpful to know, because that would also significantly impact any decision in that regard. So a lot to consider, a lot of work ahead of us, and a lot of important decisions to make in a short amount of time. And I think we all are very clear that we don't want to be rushed in this decision, that we have had and continue to have ample time, but that will require us to really put our heads down and perhaps put the foot on the accelerator just a bit and accelerate some of this work so that we are not rushed in the end. Dr. Gardner, any closing thoughts or comments as we move to adjourn?
No, not in addition to the ones you've already shared, except to thank you and the total board for your contributions to our discussion this afternoon. It's been a great, productive meeting.
All right. Well, with that, and if there are no other questions or concerns, then today's meeting of the Safety and Security Committee stands adjourned. Thank you all for tuning in. We appreciate it.